final session, so yeah, how data availability determines when these the extent of leap that can be performed, frankly. So we're going to run through a couple of TNFD pilots in the time that's remaining, and show how data availability can determine what's possible. So TBC delivered a couple of leap pilots for Global Canopy. So one was with Indusin. So Indusin is an Indian bank, and then the other was with the Private Infrastructure Development Group, Pitch. That's a development finance institution. Be probably how you would characterize that. So comparing and contrasting the two is quite useful because data limitations with Indusin are quite instructive about what you can do when you don't have location explicit information, whereas with PIDG, there was some location specific information, but yet not operational information. So you'll see what that means. So I'm going to walk through the methodologies and the results. In terms of what they were looking to understand, the first was just how can we assess not just our direct impacts but any supply chain impacts? Is that possible? Yes or no? Understand what metrics, data sources, tools, indicators can we use to measure impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. Therefore, what are the questions we need to be asking our portfolio companies, and therefore what extent of disclosure would we currently be able to deliver under TNFD or related. Alrighty, it's a lot on this slide. So, but it's kind of actually driving home a point. So, with PIDG, because they had location and asset type information about what they had holdings of, it's infrastructure holdings like hydropower, as an example. We were able to combine that with a variety of nature-related data. We'd probably bucket under 4 categories, and some of these have come up today in the course of today. We covered the WWF risk filters. We've covered IBAT was mentioned. Ones that we haven't mentioned, such as Global Forest Watch, and Ecosystem Intactness Index. So the point is there are a number of data layers that can be used, and in essence combined with this asset location information to be able to highlight what are the priority assets to engage and what you might want to be asking them. Okay, so we basically converted a lot of these nature data layers in these 3 buckets: biodiversity importance, water stress, and ecosystem integrity into thresholds which would determine whether or not that was a high priority site. So, for example, if you had something like the ecosystem intactness, high was determined to be above the 0.6 threshold. Given time, I won't go into explaining what that meant, but the presence, for example, of in Global Forest Watch of emerging hotspots and forest ecosystems, natural habitat conversion, the presence of that, the idea that freshwater ecosystems were anything more than very low or low in terms of their fragmentation. All of these things were set as thresholds to say, okay, well, what does that mean when you combine them all together for the sites that existed? So we can develop methodologies off the back of that. And then this is all of the assets then mapped. So on the left-hand side, we have STAR, which is the species threat abatement and reduction metric. So basically, where an indicator of biodiversity importance in an area, an opportunity in the area, and therefore identifying key locations based on that. Appreciate the scales. Yeah, they're kind of visible on this screen. So you can kind of see the STAR scores shown from yellow to purple, and then you can see the types of assets located on top of those. So again, that enables you to prioritize certain locations in Indonesia, as an example. And then on the other side, you see ecosystem intactness, so a measure of the integrity of ecosystems, and therefore where you really want to understand what the assets are doing in relation to those ecosystems. So again, here we flag up Australia as an example there. So this immediately is allowing there to be some priority locations and a qualitative view of potential impacts, and that represents, if you like, the evaluate layer. So we've not yet got an assessment of the risks or opportunities that those assets are facing. That requires an additional level of analysis, but we have got an idea of where we might need to prioritize. So in order to kind of go beyond this what I would describe as qualitative view of potential impacts, because we don't know how the assets are operating, we would need to have some operational information about the assets. So we would need to understand, for example, what specifically they were doing in terms of their water withdrawals, or if it was a power facility that was, Malcolm mentioned earlier on, like hot water can be a source of pollution when put out into the marine environment. So let's have a piece of operational information where the coastal marine area is seen as particularly sensitive next to the asset. Let's have a piece of information about how much hot water is being discharged, and maybe there's a measure that can be used and a metric that can be used to reduce that if we were to improve the practice at that site, just to give you a tangible example. So this is the sort of information that then could inform the dialogue with the company, the dialogue with the asset in question that PIDG holds. So this is, in a way, what the assess step focused on, because we didn't have any of this operational information. It was more just bringing together various pieces of intelligence around what the exposure of hydropower operators tends to be to physical risks and to transition risks. Are there any policy changes in that territory about how these assets are operating? What might best practice look like for no net loss, which Malcolm covered earlier? Like what might be the risks and the opportunities to reduce impact across these assets? But again, there's not the operational data to inform that. So therefore, it doesn't constitute a financial risk assessment at this stage. I'm going to pause here, because I appreciate I'm going slightly quickly, but any questions about this particular pilot and basically the extent that it was able to go to and why that's exciting, but also the reason why it wasn't able to go further, and therefore how engagement and dialogue is needed. So IndusInd, the Indian bank, so there's no asset location data, and so this locate phase at the beginning was really just able to say, well, okay, you have corporate lending across India. So where across India are the greatest biodiversity related risks and water related risks using these data layers that you see here? So STAR as a metric and the WWF water risk filter. So these are spatial tools that Malcolm talked about earlier. And this, in essence, enables IndusInd to understand that if they are, because the only company information they had to those that they were lending to was the headquarters of that company, right, or the primary, it's just the head office. That might be where the company operates, but who knows? So that's in terms of locate, that's as far as it's able to go, but that gives you an idea of what priority districts might be in terms of the operations of companies within certain sectors, which leads me to the next point, which is around the evaluate step. So in terms of evaluate on this occasion, evaluate utilized Encore at that sub-industry level. So kind of putting the two together, that, okay, well, we need to prioritize those that we lend to in these subsectors, and what we need to ask them is, do you have any operations in these priority districts? And these are the piece of information that we need to go in search of next. And then it also gave them an idea of, okay, well, percentage of the loan book actually falls into those categories, and how much work might that actually be, and maybe informs like, okay, well, how viable possible is this going to be? Is there any third-party data that we could use? What might the cost of that be? So this is the questions that it ends up enabling them to go away and be able to ask. In terms of so just comparing that to the ideal process. I mean, the ideal process at the end of multiple steps after they would get that information would be to understand that the operations of those companies with high dependency scores on nature are spread over this range. So the water withdrawals are spread over this range, and the water stress is the highest in this location. So therefore focusing on the companies with the poorest water practices and the highest stress locations, and then actually having that as a target that you would somehow set over time. And then if you had some sort of scenario information on top of that about how at that level, so for example, the aqueduct tool that we didn't go into does also have a forward-looking element to it, where it takes a couple of climate scenarios in addition to resource use, water use at that location, to basically say that there will be increased levels of water stress at these locations going forward. That increased level of water stress is an indication of whether or not there will be an increased frequency of access to water issues at that location. So you could then put that on top to say that these locations also have a greater financial exposure to nature-related physical risks going forward. So all of these next questions can eventually lead you to an idea of having this as the quantum of exposure across these high water-dependent operations in the corporate lending book. But again, this is just the beginning of the journey for them based on the data that they had available and that's available in the market. Alrighty, so I'm bringing back that triangle, which did get mentioned, and where, in summary, these pilots were able to operate. So in terms of Indocin, it's just that heat mapping stage, right? So that's where no location explicit data is available, but it was able to propose priority districts and subsectors to gather asset tags for, to gather some location information about. PIDG did have that location explicit data, but didn't have anything on how the assets were working, and equally there's no forward-looking or scenario piece to that either. So that's where that's going forward. So there's some methods proposed there. So it gives you and also in terms of, just mapping against LEA, if you think about the A step as being about the financial risk and opportunity assessment, then very much that piece does come once you start having a forward-looking view on things, if you interpret it in that way. So yeah, to wrap up, and this kind of speaks to the question about, well, how was this used? So the work does enable disclosures, and under that governance by the board of sustainability, and then also disclosures under how the risk management framework can be updated. This is a process to identify and assess and manage risks and opportunities. I know it's early days, like Malcolm said, but it provides concrete a concrete example for these institutions of how they are beginning to tackle this and what their next steps on the journey look like. And so, yeah, indeed, how learning is already affecting their decision making, or might feed into the dialogues that they have with their portfolio companies and what information they're gathering. And last of all, I know this again is early days, but you do see like how this is enabling a certain extent of physical and transition risk assessment, and that these methods are possible. And it's just a little bit of a repetitive message now, but the data landscape is evolving. Not only do we have more providers of the sorts of tools that Malcolm Inc. Highlighted earlier, but there's also activity information that can be connected with those tools, and that indeed those tools are ingesting. So many of the providers of footprinting information are ingesting asset-specific information about assets that tend to have. So it might be mining or power or something like this, where, okay, well, we can ingest that information, or we can have a data partnership agreement with that organization. Equally, as the big data providers come in, So your S&Ps of this world, they have, of course, over the time acquired such data about how power generation assets operate, where they exist, what their outputs are, what their feedstocks are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you put that together with the sorts of other nature-related data exists, you can see that you're triangulating around being able to do more than we've just outlined here, but in quite an off-the-shelf way. So you can see that moving, that just consolidation in the data space is I wouldn't necessarily say that it's happening yet, but people are still improving their tools basically. So yeah, all of that's being ingested and triangulated, and then on top of that you'll have the CSRD disclosures. So if you think about putting that on top of it, so that fits into that reported data category where we were talking about the WBA nature benchmark. So you put that on top of it, and I think that the future is only brighter for what we'll be able to do here. So yeah, nature data is available to prioritize engagement. It's worth starting LEAP, and definitely enough to inform in-house screening today. So I want to say thank you again for having us, Sitra, and everyone for staying and for being so engaged today and asking questions, and look forward to seeing you all for the next workshop. Thank you.